She came to end a legacy. He had spent his whole life protecting it. In the golden hills of Napa Valley, where sunlight transforms grape leaves into liquid amber, Eleanor Whitmore arrived with documents that would change everything. The billionaire CEO had one simple plan: sell the centuries-old vineyard and walk away with enough profit to expand her empire. But Daniel Brooks, the quiet single father who had tended these vines for 15 years, carried a secret buried deeper than the vineyard's ancient roots. A secret that could either destroy the woman who held his family's fate in her hands or transform them both in ways neither could imagine. What happens when inheritance meets betrayal, when love grows in the soil of deception, and when a dying child's future depends on the choices of two broken hearts? Welcome to our channel, where every story reminds us that healing comes from the most unexpected places. If you're ready for a tale of second chances and hidden truths, please like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Let's begin. This land remembers everything. Single Dad's secret could destroy the CEO who saved him. The morning mist clung to the Napa Valley like a whispered prayer, transforming the endless rows of grapevines into a cathedral of green and gold. Daniel Brooks moved between the vines with practiced grace, his calloused hands checking clusters that would soon become the harvest that defined this place. At 45, Daniel carried the weathered look of a man who had learned life's hardest lessons under an unforgiving sun. His dark hair showed silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held depths that spoke of loss and resilience in equal measure. This vineyard wasn't just his workplace, it was his sanctuary, his provider, his home. The sound of expensive tires on gravel announced the arrival that would change everything. Eleanor Whitmore emerged from the black Mercedes like a figure from another world. At 52, she possessed the kind of elegant authority that turned heads in boardrooms across 3 continents. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled into a perfect chignon, and her gray silk dress whispered of power and precision. She surveyed the vineyard with analytical eyes, seeing not beauty but numbers, property values, development potential, exit strategies. "Mr. Brooks," her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Daniel approached, slowly wiping earth from his hands on a cloth that had seen too many harvests. "Miss Whitmore, we've been expecting you." "Mrs. Whitmore," she corrected automatically, though the diamond wedding ring had been absent from her finger for nearly a decade. Some habits died hard, especially when they built walls. Behind Eleanor, a small army of lawyers and assessors began unpacking briefcases and tablets. They moved with the mechanical precision of people who measured life in billable hours and profit margins. "I assume you've been briefed on the situation." Eleanor continued, her gaze never quite meeting Daniel's. It was easier to maintain distance when you didn't look directly at the lives you were about to upend. "Some." Daniel's response was measured, careful. 15 years of working for the Whitmore family trust had taught him when to speak and when to listen. The Rosewood Vineyard will be sold to Meridian International within 60 days. They plan to convert the property into a luxury resort and spa. Very upscale, very profitable. She delivered the news like a weather report, factual, inevitable, requiring no emotional investment. From the shadows of the main house, a 14-year-old boy watched the proceedings with the sharp attention of someone who had learned early that adult conversations often determined his fate. Marcus Brooks had his father's steady eyes and his mother's delicate features, though illness had given him a pallor that worried everyone who loved him. "Dad's been taking care of this place since before I was born," Marcus had told his best friend just last week. "It's like it's part of him, you know." Now, watching his father stand silent before this elegant stranger, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Eleanor's assistant, a nervous woman in her 30s, approached with a tablet displaying architectural renderings. "Mrs. Whitmore, the Meridian team wanted you to see the preliminary designs. They're quite impressive." The screen showed gleaming towers rising from the earth where centuries-old vines now grew, swimming pools where Daniel's small cottage currently stood, a spa where the wine cellars held bottles that remembered the Civil War. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To someone who didn't know him, his expression remained neutral. But Eleanor, for reasons she couldn't explain, found herself studying the subtle shift in his posture. "The current staff will receive generous severance packages," she announced, as if this solved everything. Meridian has assured me that qualified employees will be considered for positions at the resort. Considerate of them. Daniel's voice carried no trace of sarcasm, but something in his tone made Eleanor glance at him sharply. Mr. Brooks, I understand this is an adjustment. Change is never easy, but sometimes it's necessary for progress. Progress. Daniel repeated the word as if testing its weight. Is that what we're calling it? For the first time since her arrival, Eleanor felt a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty. She had overseen dozens of acquisitions, displaced hundreds of employees, restructured entire divisions. It was business. It was necessary. So why did this quiet man's measured response feel like an accusation? The vineyard has been operating at a loss for 3 years, she said, her voice taking on the defensive edge she usually reserved for hostile board meetings. Sentimentality doesn't pay mortgages or employee salaries. No, ma'am, it doesn't. The simplicity of his agreement somehow felt more challenging than an argument would have. Eleanor's phone buzzed with messages from her office in San Francisco. Stock prices, merger updates, 100 decisions that required her attention. This vineyard was just one small piece of a vast empire that demanded constant management. I'll be staying at the main house for the next 2 weeks to oversee the transition, she announced. I trust that won't be a problem. No, ma'am. Marcus and I live in the cottage by the East Vineyard. We'll stay out of your way. Marcus, my son. Eleanor felt an unexpected stab of something she couldn't name. She had built her fortune by understanding people, by anticipating their motivations and leveraging their desires. But this man's simple statement, my son, carried weight that her business acumen couldn't calculate. How old is he? 14. The same age she had been when her own father died, leaving her with nothing but debt and the burning determination to never be powerless again. He's welcome to continue using the pool, Eleanor said, then immediately wondered why she had offered. The pool would be gone soon anyway, replaced by something more profitable. Thank you, that's kind. Kind. When had anyone last called her kind? Her shareholders called her brilliant. Her competitors called her ruthless. Her board called her indispensable. But kind, the assessment teams spread across the property like ants at a picnic, measuring and photographing everything. Eleanor watched them work with the satisfaction of someone who had turned efficiency into an art form. But her attention kept drifting to Daniel as he moved through his daily routines. She noticed how he paused to examine grape clusters with the careful attention of a surgeon. How he spoke to the seasonal workers in fluent Spanish, his tone respectful and warm. How he seemed to know every vine, every barrel, every inch of soil, as if they were old friends. Ma'am, her assistant approached with another tablet. The soil analysis is complete. Meridian will want to see these results before finalizing their offer. Eleanor scrolled through pages of technical data, pH levels, mineral content, drainage patterns. Everything reduced to numbers and recommendations. Everything except the way Daniel's face changed when he thought no one was watching, the weight of responsibility and loss that aged him beyond his years. That evening, as Eleanor sat on the main house veranda with a glass of the vineyard's own Cabernet Sauvignon, she found herself studying the view that Daniel saw every morning. Rolling hills painted gold by the setting sun. Vine rows that followed the natural curves of the landscape like green rivers. Ancient oak trees that had shaded this place since before California was a state. It was undeniably beautiful. But beauty didn't appear on balance sheets. Excuse me, ma'am. Eleanor turned to find Marcus standing at the edge of the veranda, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He had his father's quiet dignity, but there was something fragile about him that made her think of rare books or delicate glass. Yes. I just wanted to say thank you. For the pool, Dad thinks I don't know, but the doctors said swimming would be good for... He trailed off, touching his chest unconsciously. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. For what? Marcus glanced toward the cottage where warm light spilled from windows, then back at her. Nothing serious, just some hard stuff. Kid stuff, you know. But Eleanor did know. She knew the careful way he moved, the slight breathlessness. When he spoke, the protective shadow that crossed Daniel's face whenever someone mentioned his son's future. Swimming is good exercise, she said carefully. Yeah, Dad taught me to swim in that pool when I was 7, right after Mom died. Marcus's voice remained steady, but Eleanor saw his hands tighten into fists. He said it would help me stay strong. The weight of that simple statement settled over Eleanor like a lead blanket. A widowed father, a sick child, a home about to be destroyed for the sake of profit margins in development plans. "Your father seems like a good man," Eleanor said, surprised by the roughness in her own voice. "He's the best man I know." Marcus spoke with the fierce certainty of someone defending a faith. "He gave up everything to take care of me. Could have left after Mom died, gotten a job in the city that paid better. But he stayed because he knew I loved this place." Eleanor found herself thinking of her own father, who had spent his final years fighting to save a small hardware store that progress inevitably swallowed. She had been so angry with him for clinging to the past when she could see the future so clearly. "Sometimes people have to make hard choices," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Yeah," Marcus nodded solemnly. "That's what Dad always says. But he also says that some things are worth fighting for even when fighting seems pointless." With that, the boy disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Eleanor alone with her wine and the uncomfortable feeling that she had just been given a lesson in values by a 14-year-old. The next morning brought the sound of machinery as surveyors began mapping the property for development. Eleanor watched from her office window as they planted flags and stakes marking the future locations of buildings that would erase centuries of history. Daniel moved through the vineyard like a man saying goodbye to old friends. He touched vine posts with gentle familiarity, checked irrigation lines that wouldn't matter. In 60 days, tended to details that only someone who truly cared would notice. Around noon, Eleanor found herself walking the vineyard paths, telling herself she was inspecting the property, but knowing she was really trying to understand what Daniel saw when he looked at this place. "The Pinot Noir section." Daniel's voice startled her from her thoughts. She hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry. You're standing in the Pinot Noir section, 1987 planting. These vines were just getting established when I started working here." Eleanor looked around at the orderly rows, seeing them suddenly not as obstacles to development, but as living things with history and purpose. "You've been here 15 years. 15 years next month." Daniel's voice carried quiet pride. "Started as seasonal help during harvest. The previous owner, Mr. Whitmore, your uncle, I believe, took a chance on a kid with more enthusiasm than experience. Uncle Thomas." Eleanor remembered him vaguely from childhood visits, a gentle man who had chosen grapes over profit, legacy over logic. The family had never understood his choices. "He taught me everything," Daniel continued. "How to read the soil, when to prune, how to know when the grapes are ready." Said winemaking was part science, part art, and part faith. Faith. Faith that the land would provide. Faith that good work would be rewarded. Faith that some things matter more than money. The implied criticism stung because it rang true. Eleanor had built her empire by believing that everything had a price, that sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, that progress required sacrificing the past. "Mr. Brooks, I understand you have an emotional attachment to this place, but emotional attachments don't pay for medical bills or college tuitions." Daniel's expression didn't change, but Eleanor caught the almost imperceptible flinch when she mentioned medical bills. "No, ma'am, they don't." They stood in uncomfortable silence, surrounded by the gentle sound of wind moving through leaves. Eleanor found herself remembering her uncle's letters, which she had dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who had chosen failure over progress. "The land remembers everything," he had written in his final letter. "Every storm weathered, every harvest, celebrated every family that called it home. Someday you'll understand that wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you preserve for the next generation." Eleanor had filed the letter away with other sentimental documents she never intended to read again. But standing here watching Daniel tend to vines with the care most people reserve for children, she began to wonder if her uncle had been trying to tell her something important. "Mrs. Whitmore." Daniel's voice pulled her from her memories. "Would you like to see the wine cellar? Your uncle was particularly proud of the vintage collection." Eleanor nodded, following Daniel down stone steps that led beneath the main house. The cellar was cool and dark, lined with racks that held bottles like sleeping memories. Some labels were so faded they were barely readable. Others bore dates that reached back to the 19th century. Daniel moved through the space with reverent familiarity, his fingers trailing along bottlenecks as he navigated by touch as much as sight. "This one," he said, stopping before a particular rack. 1943 Cabernet Sauvignon. Your uncle told me his grandfather made it during the war when sugar was rationed and help was scarce. Somehow it turned out to be one of the finest vintages they ever produced. Eleanor studied the bottle, its glass, dark with age, its label a testament to perseverance under impossible circumstances. He used to say that the best wines come from the hardest years, Daniel continued. That struggle gives depth to sweetness, makes you appreciate what you might otherwise take for granted. Was he talking about wine or life? Eleanor couldn't be sure, but something in his tone suggested the lesson went deeper than viticulture. Mr. Brooks, she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she was sorry, that she understood, that destroying this place felt increasingly like vandalism rather than progress. Yes, ma'am. Nothing, thank you for the tour. But as they climbed back toward daylight, Eleanor found herself thinking about struggle and sweetness, about preservation and progress, about the difference between accumulating wealth and creating legacy. That evening, she sat on the veranda again, this time with a bottle from the cellar, a modest Merlot from a year when the rains had been scarce and the harvest uncertain. It was, she had to admit, extraordinary. Complex and layered with depths that revealed themselves, slowly rewarding patience with revelation. Through the cottage windows, she could see Daniel helping Marcus with homework at their kitchen table. The scene was so ordinary, so peaceful, that it made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. Her phone rang, her assistant, calling with updates from the office. There were contracts to review, mergers to finalize, board meetings to prepare for. The machinery of empire demanded constant attention, but for the first time in decades, Eleanor let the call go to voicemail. Instead, she sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the soft sounds of a vineyard settling into evening, and tried to remember when she had last felt peace instead of ambition, contentment instead of the endless hunger for more. The answer, she realized with uncomfortable clarity, was that she couldn't remember it all. 3 days into Eleanor's stay, the autumn morning arrived with the kind of golden light that made even pragmatists believe in magic. Eleanor found herself walking the vineyard before dawn, drawn by something she couldn't name, toward the place where Daniel would soon begin his daily routines. She discovered him in the oldest section of the vineyard, where gnarled vines twisted like ancient hands reaching toward the sky. He was kneeling beside a particularly weathered vine, his fingers gentle against bark that had weathered decades of seasons. This one's not producing anymore, Eleanor observed, approaching quietly. Daniel looked up, not startled by her presence. No, ma'am, not for 3 years now. Then why keep it? Daniel's smile was soft, tinged with something Eleanor was learning to recognize as his particular brand of wisdom. Because she's earned her rest. This vine was planted in 1892. She's given us over a century of harvests. Seems disrespectful to tear her down just because she's tired. Eleanor found herself studying the ancient vine with new eyes. In her world, things that stopped producing value were eliminated. Efficiency demanded it. Profit required it. But Daniel spoke of the vine as if she were an honored elder, deserving of care rather than disposal. Your uncle felt the same way. Daniel continued, rising to his feet, said the old vines were the heart of the place, that as long as they stood, the vineyard remembered its purpose. He was sentimental? Yes, ma'am, he was. But Daniel's agreement sounded less like criticism than admiration, and Eleanor felt another small shift in her understanding of the man who had chosen grapes over gold. The surveyors arrived promptly at 8, their equipment glinting in the morning sun as they continued mapping the property for destruction. Eleanor watched them work from her office window, noting the methodical way they reduced living beauty to measurements and coordinates. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Come in. Marcus entered carrying a tray with coffee and what appeared to be homemade pastries. Dad thought you might be hungry. He made these this morning before the work started. Eleanor accepted the coffee, gratefully surprised by the thoughtfulness. Your father cooks? Everything. Had to learn when Mom died. Marcus settled into the chair across from her desk with the casual confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. Mom was the baker in the family, but Dad's gotten pretty good at it. Eleanor bit into one of the pastries, flaky, buttery, with a hint of vanilla that spoke of care rather than convenience. These are excellent. He uses ingredients from the vineyard kitchen garden. Says food tastes better when you know where it comes from. Another small lesson in values delivered without preaching. Eleanor found herself wondering when she had last eaten anything that hadn't come from a restaurant or her assistant's emergency snack supply. Marcus, she said carefully, how do you feel about the sale? The boy's expression grew thoughtful, older than his 14 years. Scared, I guess. This is the only home I remember, but Dad says sometimes we have to trust that change leads to better things even when we can't see them coming. Your father is very wise. Yeah, but he's also sad about it, even though he tries to hide it. I can tell because he spends more time in the wine cellar lately. He goes there when he needs to think. Eleanor filed this information away, adding it to her growing understanding of the man who was somehow becoming more real to her with each passing day. What will you do after the sale, I mean? Marcus shrugged with forced casualness. Dad says we'll figure it out. Maybe move to the city where there are better hospitals. He touched his chest unconsciously. The doctors want to keep a closer eye on me anyway. The casual mention of hospitals sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had assumed the boy's condition was minor manageable, but the way he spoke of doctors and monitoring suggested something more serious. How long have you been having heart problems? Since I was born, some kind of defect. Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who had lived with uncertainty his entire life. It's gotten worse lately, but the doctors say it's manageable with the right treatment. Manageable. Eleanor knew what that meant in medical terms. Expensive, ongoing, requiring access to specialists and facilities that weren't available in rural areas. Does the vineyard's insurance cover your treatment? Dad says it does. It's one of the reasons he stayed here so long, even when other jobs paid better. The Whitmore Family Trust has really good medical coverage. Eleanor felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. The insurance policy that covered Marcus's treatment was tied to Daniel's employment at the vineyard. When the property sold when Daniel lost his job, she spent the rest of the morning reviewing employment contracts and insurance documents, her business training warring with something else, something that felt uncomfortably like conscience. The coverage was comprehensive but specific, tied directly to vineyard employment, non-transferable. When the sale completed, Daniel's insurance would end, and with it, Marcus's access to the specialized care that kept him stable. Eleanor stared at the documents until the numbers blurred, trying to calculate costs that couldn't be measured in dollars alone. That afternoon, she found herself drawn to the wine cellar again. The cool stone spaces felt like a sanctuary removed from the complications of the surface world. She moved among the racks, slowly reading labels and dates like archaeological evidence of time passing. Ms. Whitmore. Eleanor turned to find Daniel emerging from the deeper sections of the cellar, a bottle in his hands and dust on his shirt. I was just exploring, she said, feeling oddly like she'd been caught trespassing. You're welcome here anytime. Your uncle spent hours down here, said it helped him think. Daniel approached one of the older racks, running his fingers along bottles with the careful touch of someone handling living things. He used to tell stories about these wines. Which years were difficult, which harvests were blessed, who was here to help with the work. You miss him. Every day. Daniel's voice was soft with genuine affection. He was like a father to me after mine died. Taught me that work could be more than just earning money. It could be about building something that mattered. Eleanor found herself studying Daniel's profile in the cellar's dim light. There was something about his reverence for this place, his connection to its history, that made her feel both envious and ashamed. When had she last cared about anything beyond quarterly profits and market position? Mr. Brooks, she began, then stopped. How could she ask about Marcus's condition without revealing that she'd been investigating their private business? Yes, ma'am. Marcus seems like a remarkable young man. He is. Daniel's face lit with paternal pride that was impossible to fake. Strong, smart, kind, everything his mother was, plus a resilience that amazes me every day. It must be difficult, raising a child alone. Some days. Daniel's honesty was refreshing in its simplicity. But Marcus makes it easy. He's never complained, not once, about the sacrifices we've had to make. Just grateful for what we have. The weight of what they were about to lose, home security, medical coverage, the only life the boy had ever known, settled over Eleanor like a physical burden. Daniel, she said, using his first name without thinking, what will you do about Marcus's medical care after? She saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like resignation. You know about his condition. I reviewed the employment contracts, the insurance, which I would do. Daniel nodded slowly, his hand stilling on the wine bottle he'd been holding. We'll figure something out. There are armored programs for people in our situation. It might mean moving to the city, being closer to hospitals. But the treatment is expensive. Yes, Daniel's voice was steady, but Eleanor could see the fear he was trying to hide. The specialists, the medications, the monitoring. Without insurance, he didn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor could complete it. Without insurance, Marcus's care would become a choice between financial ruin and medical necessity, the kind of choice that destroyed families. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel met her eyes with quiet dignity. Because it's not your responsibility. And because I know you have to make business decisions based on what's best for the company, not what's convenient for the employees. The simple grace of his response made Eleanor feel small in a way that boardroom confrontations never had. Here was a man facing the loss of his child's health care, and he was worried about her discomfort. There must be something, Eleanor began, then stopped. What could she do? Delay the inevitable, find some legal loophole that would postpone rather than prevent their crisis. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. Ms. Whitmore, I know you didn't create this situation, and I know you're trying to do what's best for everyone. Some things just don't have easy answers. His acceptance made Eleanor want to scream with frustration. Where was his anger, his demand for fairness, his accusation that she was destroying lives for profit? Instead, he offered understanding. She hadn't earned in grace she didn't deserve. That evening, Eleanor couldn't concentrate on the business calls that usually commanded her attention. Her mind kept drifting to Marcus sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, while his father cooked dinner with ingredients from a garden that would soon be paved over for parking. She found herself walking the vineyard again as darkness fell, drawn by lights in the cottage windows and the sound of laughter that carried on the evening air. Through the window, she could see Danielle helping Marcus with what appeared to be a science project. Solar system models covered the kitchen table, and both father and son were expressions of intense concentration as they positioned tiny planets around a yellow sun. The scene was so achingly normal, so full of the kind of simple happiness Eleanor had forgotten existed, that she had to turn away. But as she walked back toward the main house, she heard Marcus's voice carrying through the open window. Dad, do you think we'll still be able to see the stars as clearly from the city? Daniel's response was too quiet to hear, but something in his tone made Eleanor stop walking. I know you're worried about the money for my doctor visits, Marcus continued with the devastating honesty of children. But Dr. Martinez says lots of kids have heart problems and live normal lives. I'll be okay, Dad, really. This time, Eleanor did hear Daniel's response rough with barely contained emotion. I know you will, son. You're the strongest person I know. Eleanor stood in the darkness beyond the cottage, eavesdropping on a private moment of love and fear, and felt something crack open inside her chest. The next morning brought rain, the first real storm of the season, with wind that bent the vine rows and turned the property roads into muddy streams. Eleanor watched from her office as the surveyors packed up their equipment and retreated to town, their precise measurements temporarily defeated by weather. Daniel moved through his routines, seemingly unbothered by the downpour, checking drainage systems and securing equipment with the methodical care of someone who had weathered many storms. Around noon, Eleanor found herself pulling on a rain jacket and venturing into the vineyard, drawn by something she couldn't name, toward the man who somehow remained steady while her own world tilted off its axis. She found him in the equipment barn, repairing a piece of machinery with the focused attention of someone for whom everything was precious and nothing was disposable. Ms. Whitmore, he looked up, surprise flickering across his features. Is everything all right? I wanted to. That is, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about not having easy answers. Daniel set down his tools, giving her his full attention despite the dripping rain that ran from her jacket onto the barn floor. Sometimes, Eleanor continued, in business, we get so focused on the end goal that we forget about the people affected by our decisions. But this isn't just business, is it? No, ma'am, it's home, it's family, it's... Daniel paused, searching for words. It's the difference between existing and living. Eleanor felt that truth settle into her bones, heavy and inescapable. I built my company by believing that efficiency was everything. That sentiment was weakness. That progress required sacrifice. And now, Now I'm wondering if I was wrong about what progress actually means. They stood in the barn doorway watching rain transform the vineyard into something primordial and beautiful. The vines seemed to drink the moisture gratefully, their leaves turning brilliant green in the stormlight. Your uncle used to say that the rain was the vineyard's way of crying and celebrating at the same time, Daniel said softly, washing away what was finished, preparing for what was coming next. Eleanor found herself thinking about tears and transformation, about endings that might actually be beginnings if viewed from the right angle. Daniel, she said, her voice barely audible above the rain, what if there were another way? Another way? What if the vineyard didn't have to be sold? What if it could be preserved instead of developed? Daniel's expression shifted from polite attention to something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. Ms. Whitmore, I appreciate the thought, but the financial reports are clear. The vineyard loses money. Has for years. What if it didn't have to make money? What if breaking even was enough? I don't understand. Eleanor took a deep breath, voicing thoughts that had been forming in the corners of her mind for days. What if instead of selling to developers, we turned the vineyard into something else, a heritage site, a working museum, a place where people could come to learn about winemaking and agricultural history? Daniel's eyes widened with the dangerous glow of possibility. You mean keep it operating? I mean transform it. Winemaking demonstrations, educational programs, sustainable agriculture research. We could partner with universities, agricultural colleges, create something that honors the past while building toward the future. The words came faster now, Eleanor's business mind engaging with this new problem in ways that felt foreign and familiar at once. The income wouldn't match development profits, but it could be sustainable. More importantly, it could preserve what matters while creating something valuable for the community. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through hope, skepticism, and something that looked like prayer. Ms. Whitmore, he said finally, that would be incredible. But the cost of conversion, the legal complications, the time it would take to establish, I know it would be complex, risky, probably take years to implement properly. And your company, your board of directors, they'd support this. Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips, the first genuine smile she'd felt in longer than she could remember. My company will support whatever I decide. And if the board doesn't like it, they can find themselves a new CEO. Daniel stared at her as if she had just offered to move mountains with her bare hands. You would do that? Give up the development profits to save this place? Daniel, 3 weeks ago, I would have told you that profits were the only thing that mattered, that preserving the past was foolish sentimentality. Eleanor paused, watching rain cascade from the barn roof like a liquid curtain. But I'm starting to think that some things are worth more than money. Some legacies deserve to be protected. Like what? Eleanor thought of Marcus doing homework at the kitchen table of Daniel's gentle hands, tending ancient vines of wine that carried the memory of decades in its depths. Like home, she said simply, like family, like the difference between existing and living. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared at the barn door, rain-soaked but grinning. Dad, the power's out at the cottage. Can we eat dinner by candlelight like when I was little? Daniel's face lit with the kind of joy Eleanor was learning to recognize as his greatest treasure, the simple happiness of being Marcus's father. Of course. We'll make it an adventure. Marcus noticed Eleanor, then his expression shifting to polite curiosity. Miss Whitmore, are you coming to dinner too? Dad always makes extra, and candlelight dinners are more fun with more people. Eleanor felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. When had anyone last invited her to dinner? Because they thought she would make things more fun. I wouldn't want to intrude. And you wouldn't be intruding, Daniel said, his voice gentle with an invitation that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than politeness. You'd be welcome. Eleanor found herself nodding, accepting an invitation that felt like far more than dinner. It felt like the first step toward understanding what she had been missing all these years while building her empire of efficiency and profit. As they ran through the rain toward the cottage, Eleanor realized she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a meal prepared by someone who cared whether she enjoyed it. The thought was both wonderful and heartbreaking. The cottage was warm and welcoming, despite the power outage filled with the golden glow of candles and the rich scent of something delicious simmering on the gas stove. Daniel moved around the small kitchen with practiced grace, while Marcus set the table and told Eleanor about his solar system project with the enthusiasm of someone who found wonder in everything. This, Eleanor thought as she watched father and son work together in perfect harmony, was what her uncle had been trying to preserve. Not just vines and wine and property values, but the kind of love that made a house into a home. As they sat down to dinner, homemade soup and bread that Daniel had baked himself, simple food transformed into something special. By care and attention, Eleanor felt herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in decades. "Ms. Whitmore," Marcus said between bites, "Dad told me you might have an idea about keeping the vineyard open. Is that true?" Eleanor glanced at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. "It's just an idea right now, Marcus. But yes, I'm exploring options for preserving this place instead of selling it for development." Marcus's face lit up like sunrise. "Really, you mean we might not have to move?" "It's not certain yet," Eleanor cautioned, not wanting to raise hopes that might be crushed. "There would be a lot of work involved, a lot of changes. But we could stay, and Dad could keep taking care of the vines, and I could keep swimming in the pool." The simple joy in the boy's voice made Eleanor's chest ache. When had anyone been this excited about her business decisions? When had her choices meant hope instead of disruption for the people they affected? If we can make it work, yes, all of that. Marcus turned to his father with eyes shining. "Dad, did you hear that we might get to stay?" Daniel's smile was soft with cautious hope and something that looked like gratitude. "I heard, son, but remember, it's still just a possibility." "But it's a good possibility, right?" Mrs. Whitmore wouldn't say it if she didn't mean it. Eleanor found herself meeting Daniel's gaze across the candlelit table, seeing reflected there the same hope and fear and desperate love that filled her own chest. "I mean it," she said, the words feeling like a promise. "I can't guarantee success, but I give you my word that I'll try everything in my power to make it happen." As they finished dinner and Marcus excused himself to work on homework, Eleanor helped Daniel clear the dishes, moving around the small kitchen in a domesticity that felt foreign and natural at once. "Eleanor," Daniel said softly as they worked, "I need you to know what this means. Not just keeping our home, but knowing that someone cares enough to fight for it." Eleanor felt tears threaten for the first time in years. "Daniel, I need you to know something too. 3 weeks ago, I was certain that success meant accumulation, that the only thing worth building was wealth." She paused, hanging up the dish towel with careful precision. "But watching you and Marcus, seeing how you care for this place and each other, I think I've been measuring the wrong things." "What are you measuring now?" Eleanor considered the question, thinking of Marcus's laughter and Daniel's gentle strength and the way candlelight transforms simple food into something sacred. "Legacy, I think. Not what I can take with me, but what I leave behind. Not what I can accumulate, but what I can preserve for the next generation." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding, passing between them like shared prayer. "Your uncle would be proud," he said simply. And Eleanor realized with a clarity that took her breath away that Daniel's approval meant more to her than any board resolution or profit report ever had. As she walked back to the main house through rain that had gentled into mist, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the deep satisfaction of making a choice based on values, rather than value on love, rather than logic on what was right, rather than what was profitable. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without checking her phone, without reviewing tomorrow's agenda, without calculating angles and advantages. Instead, she dreamed of vineyards, in starlight of a boy's laughter, in a man's gentle hands tending something precious of legacy that couldn't be measured in dollars, but could be felt in the very soil beneath their feet. Eleanor woke to the sound of sirens cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Emergency lights flashed red and blue against her bedroom windows, transforming the peaceful vineyard into something urgent and frightening. She threw on clothes and raced outside to find paramedics loading a stretcher into an ambulance. Even in the chaotic light, she could see Daniel's anguished face as he climbed in beside the small figure on the gurney. Marcus. Eleanor's business training kicked in automatically, assess the situation, identify the problems, create solutions. But for once, her analytical mind felt utterly inadequate in the face of raw human fear. She followed the ambulance to the county hospital, driving her Mercedes through empty streets while her mind raced through everything she knew about Marcus's condition. Heart defect, manageable with treatment, getting worse lately. The waiting room was sterile and harsh after the vineyard's golden warmth. Daniel sat in one of the plastic chairs, his head in his hands, still wearing the clothes he'd thrown on when Marcus collapsed in the middle of the night. Eleanor approached carefully, unsure of her place in this crisis, but unable to leave. Daniel. He looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion and fear. Eleanor, you didn't have to come. Of course I did. She sat beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not close enough to intrude. How is he? They're running tests. His heart, the rhythm was irregular, and he couldn't catch his breath. They sedated him to help him rest, but Daniel's voice broke slightly. Dr. Martinez is on her way in from San Francisco. Eleanor knew that name from the insurance files. Marcus's cardiologist, a specialist in pediatric heart conditions. The fact that she was driving 2 hours at dawn spoke to the seriousness of the situation. What can I do? How can I help? Daniel's laugh was short and bitter. Unless you can give my son a new heart, there's not much anyone can do right now. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She had been so focused on preserving Marcus's access to care that she hadn't fully grasped the gravity of his condition. Daniel, I need to tell you something. About the insurance, about what happens after the sale. I know. Daniel's voice was calm in the way of someone who had accepted the unthinkable. Marcus's coverage ends when my employment does. We've known that for months. Then why didn't you fight the sale? Why didn't you demand that I find a way to preserve your benefits? Because fighting wouldn't change the vineyard's finances. And because Marcus would rather have 6 months of normal life than years of watching his father battle battles that can't be won. Eleanor stared at this man who was somehow maintaining dignity and grace while facing every parent's worst nightmare. In her world, people fought viciously for far less important things. Daniel was facing the loss of his home, his job, and his son's health care, and his greatest concern was making sure Marcus felt safe and loved. Martinez arrived as the sun was rising, a competent woman in her 50s who moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Mr. Brooks, I'm sorry to meet under these circumstances. Eleanor watched Daniel's face as the doctor explained the test results. Marcus's condition was deteriorating faster than anticipated. The medications that had kept him stable were losing their effectiveness. Surgery was becoming not just recommended, but necessary. How necessary? Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Within the next few months. His heart is working too hard to maintain adequate circulation. Without intervention. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Marcus was running out of time. What kind of surgery, Eleanor found herself asking, though she had no right to insert herself into this private medical consultation. Dr. Martinez glanced at Daniel, who nodded permission. Valve replacement, possibly more extensive repair, depending on what we find once we're inside. It's a complex procedure, but Marcus is a good candidate. Young, otherwise healthy, strong surgical history in his family. Cost? The word slipped out before Eleanor could stop it, her business mind automatically calculating the financial implications. Without insurance, approximately $300,000, plus recovery costs, follow-up care medications. Probably closer to $500,000 all told. Eleanor felt the number hit Daniel like a physical blow, saw him age years in the space of heartbeats. We have insurance now, Daniel said carefully. Will you recommend the surgery before him? I can recommend emergency authorization if his condition worsens suddenly, but ideally we'd schedule it in the next month or two when he's stable enough to handle the trauma. After the sale, after Daniel's insurance ended, after their coverage became a memory instead of a lifeline. Eleanor excused herself and stepped into the hospital corridor, pulling out her phone with hands that shook slightly. She called her assistant, her legal team, her insurance specialists. There had to be something, some way to extend coverage, some legal loophole, some corporate policy that could bridge the gap between now and Marcus's surgery. The answers were all variations on the same theme. Insurance was tied to employment. Employment was tied to the vineyard. The vineyard was scheduled for sale in 6 weeks. Unless, Eleanor stared at her phone, an idea forming that was either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. She called her lead attorney, pulling him away from his morning coffee with the kind of urgency usually reserved for hostile takeovers. Richard, I need you to research something for me, immediately. Of course, what are we looking at? I want to know if there's a legal way to delay the Meridian sale, temporarily, without breaching our contract or incurring penalties. Delay it, Eleanor. The contracts are signed. The development permits are in process. The board has approved the sale unanimously. I don't care about the board. I need to know if it's legally possible. Richard's silence suggested he was trying to determine if his most profitable client had suffered some kind of breakdown. There might be environmental review requirements, he said carefully, historical preservation challenges, archaeological surveys. But Eleanor deliberately delaying this sale would cost millions in development fees and legal complications. How long could we delay it? 6 months, maybe a year if we're creative. But the legal fees alone, do it. Eleanor, I need to ask if you're feeling all right. This doesn't sound like you. Eleanor looked through the hospital quarter window at Daniel, who was sitting by Marcus's bedside, now reading softly from a book while his son slept. The morning light through the window turned them both golden, father and son, connected by love that transcended every practical consideration. Richard, how long have you known me? 15 years. And in all that time, have you ever seen me make a decision I regretted? No, but then trust me now. File whatever paperwork is necessary to delay the Meridian sale. Environmental review, historical significance, archaeological potential. I don't care what reasons you use, just buy me time. How much time? Eleanor calculated quickly. Marcus needed surgery within 2 months. Daniel's insurance ran until the sale completed. If they could delay the sale by 6 months, a year, she said firmly, buy me a full year. She ended the call and returned to Marcus's room, where Daniel was maintaining his vigil with the patient devotion she was learning to recognize as his defining characteristic. Eleanor, everything all right? Fine, just some business calls. Eleanor approached Marcus's bedside, looking down at the boy, whose pale face made him seem younger than his 14 years. How is he better? The medications are helping regulate his rhythm. Dr. Martinez says we can probably take him home this afternoon. Home, Eleanor realized with uncomfortable clarity that in 6 weeks Daniel and Marcus wouldn't have a home to return to. They would be adrift in a world that demanded money they didn't have for treatment their son desperately needed. Daniel, I want to discuss something with you about the vineyard sale. What about it? Eleanor chose her words carefully, aware that she was about to make promises that would either save this family or destroy her own company. I've asked my legal team to explore delaying the sale, temporarily. Daniel's hand stilled on Marcus's blanket. Delaying it, why? Because Marcus needs surgery and you need insurance, and some things are more important than development schedules. Daniel stared at her as if she had announced her intention to stop the sun from rising. Eleanor, you can't delay a $500 million sale because one of your employees has a sick child. Your board would never allow it. My board works for me, not the other way around. And this isn't about one employee, it's about doing what's right. But the costs are my concern, not yours. Marcus stirred in his sleep, murmuring something inaudible, and Daniel's attention immediately refocused on his son. Eleanor watched him smooth the boy's hair with infinite gentleness and felt her resolve harden into something unshakable. This was what mattered, not profit margins or board approval or quarterly reports, but the simple miracle of a father's love for his child. Daniel, she said softly, I want to tell you something about my Uncle Thomas. Daniel looked up, surprised by the change of subject. I thought he was weak, sentimental, too attached to the past to make hard business decisions. Eleanor pulled a chair closer to Marcus's bed, settling in as if she planned to stay. I spent years being embarrassed by his choices, by his refusal to modernize the vineyard or sell it for development. He loved this place. Yes, he did. But more than that, he understood something I'm only beginning to learn. Which is, Eleanor thought of board meetings and profit projections of the empire she had built by measuring everything except what actually mattered. He understood that some legacies are worth preserving, even when preserving them costs more than destroying them. That some things can't be measured in dollars because their value transcends money. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like hope, carefully controlled. Eleanor, what are you saying? I'm saying that the vineyard isn't going to be sold. Not to Meridian, not to anyone. I'm converting it to a heritage foundation, a working vineyard dedicated to sustainable agriculture and winemaking education. but the financial losses will be covered by foundation grants and educational partnerships. It won't be as profitable as development, but it will be sustainable. And more importantly, it will preserve what Uncle Thomas believed was worth saving. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and his gaze moving between Eleanor and his sleeping son. The insurance, he said finally. If the vineyard continues operating, your benefits continue. Marcus gets his surgery. You keep your home. Eleanor felt tears threaten again, but this time they were tears of possibility rather than regret. And maybe if you're willing, you could help me learn how to run a place that values legacy over profit. Daniel's smile began slowly like sunrise breaking over the vineyard hills. You want me to stay? To help run the Heritage Foundation? I want you to be my partner in this, not just as an employee, but as someone who understands what we're really trying to preserve. Marcus chose that moment to wake up, his eyes fluttering open to find Eleanor and his father sitting beside his bed like guardian angels. Dad, Miss Whitmore, what's happening? Are you both crying? Eleanor laughed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Happy tears, Marcus. We're crying because sometimes the world surprises you with second chances. Second chances for what? For everything. Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. For home, for family, for the kind of future where you get to grow up in the place you love. Marcus looked between them with the sharp intelligence that had always made him seem older than his years. You mean we get to stay at the vineyard? We get to stay, Eleanor confirmed. All of us. The next few days passed in a blur of legal documents and media calls as Eleanor's decision to convert the vineyard sent shockwaves through the business community. Her stock price fluctuated wildly as investors tried to determine if she had lost her mind or found her soul. Eleanor discovered she didn't particularly care which interpretation they preferred. Richard worked 18-hour days to untangle the Meridian contracts and establish the legal framework for the Heritage Foundation. The process was complex, expensive, and exactly as complicated as he had warned. Eleanor had never enjoyed a business challenge more. Daniel threw himself into planning the vineyard's transformation with the enthusiasm of someone who had been given permission to dream. His ideas were practical and visionary, in equal measure educational programs that would teach sustainable farming partnerships with culinary schools for wine and food pairing courses, research initiatives that would advance agricultural science while preserving traditional techniques. We could host school groups, he suggested during one of their evening planning sessions on the main house veranda. Let kids see where food actually comes from, how long it takes to grow something worthwhile. I love that. Eleanor made notes on her tablet, her business mind engaging with possibilities that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with purpose. What about internship programs? Give young people hands-on experience with sustainable agriculture. And we could preserve the oldest vines as living history, Marcus added from his chair nearby. He was still weak from his hospital stay, but his color was better, and his eyes sparkled with excitement about the future. Like a museum you can walk through. Eleanor looked at the wicked who had inadvertently changed her understanding of success, then at his father, who had shown her the difference between accumulating wealth and creating legacy. Marcus, she said, how would you like to be the Heritage Foundation's first youth advisor? Someone to help us understand what programs would actually interest people your age. Marcus's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really, you mean like a real job? Like a real job with real responsibilities and real input into real decisions. Eleanor found herself thinking of her own childhood spent in boardrooms and offices where adults made decisions about things that affected children without ever asking what those children actually wanted or needed. But first, Daniel said firmly, you focus on getting well. Dr. Martinez scheduled your surgery for next month, and I want you at full strength before we add work responsibilities to your life. The surgery. Eleanor had been trying not to think about it, but it loomed over all their plans like a storm cloud. No matter how optimistic the doctor sounded, surgery on a 14-year-old's heart carried risks that made her business challenges seem insignificant. Dad, I'll be fine, Marcus said with the casual confidence of someone too young to fully grasp mortality. Dr. Martinez says kids my age bounce back really fast from this kind of operation. Dr. Martinez is right, Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain steady. And when you're recovered, we'll put you to work to teaching tourists how to identify different grape varieties. Can I design the educational programs? Maybe create interactive displays. You can do whatever your heart tells you to do, Eleanor said, then winced at her word choice. Marcus laughed, apparently unbothered by the reference to the organ that had caused him so much trouble. Good, because I have lots of ideas about making agriculture interesting to people who think food just appears in grocery stores. As Marcus excused himself to rest, Eleanor and Daniel sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over vines that would now be protected rather than destroyed. Eleanor, Daniel said softly, I need you to know that what you're doing, sacrificing profits to save this place, it's more than generosity, it's courage. Courage. It takes courage to admit you were wrong about what matters. It takes courage to choose values over value. And it takes incredible courage to trust that doing the right thing will somehow work out financially. Eleanor considered his words, thinking about the board meeting she had scheduled for next week where she would formally announce the vineyard's conversion to heritage status. Daniel, can I ask you something? Anything. Are you afraid about Marcus's surgery, about all the changes we're making, about whether this foundation idea will actually work? Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the cottage, where warm light spilled from windows, and his son was probably reading or working on homework with the steady focus that defined him. Terrified, he admitted. But fear and hope aren't opposites, are they? You can be afraid and still believe that something beautiful is possible. Eleanor nodded, understanding flooding through her, like wine through good soil. Then we'll be afraid and hopeful together, she said. Partners in preserving what matters even when we can't predict the outcome. The surgery took place on a crisp October morning when the vineyard was dressed in autumn colors that made the world look like a painting. Eleanor and Daniel spent 8 hours in another hospital waiting room, this one in San Francisco, where Marcus's procedure was being performed by a surgical team that Dr. Martinez had personally assembled. Eleanor had never experienced the particular agony of waiting for news about someone she loved. Her business crises had always been controllable, manageable, through strategic thinking and decisive action. But surgery was surrender, the acknowledgement that some things were beyond her influence, no matter how much money or power she possessed. Daniel handled the waiting with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else, but Eleanor could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. He's going to be fine, she said at one point, offering comfort she hoped was true. I know, Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the terror that lurked just beneath the surface. Marcus is strong, stronger than I am most days. He gets that from you. He gets that from his mother. She faced cancer with the same calm courage Marcus shows with his heart condition. Like they both understood that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the odds. Eleanor thought about battles and courage, about the difference between fighting for profit and fighting for love. Her entire career had been built on strategic victories, but none of them had required the kind of raw bravery she was witnessing in Daniel. De Martinez finally emerged from surgery looking tired but satisfied. The procedure went beautifully. We were able to repair the valve without replacement, which means better long-term outcomes and fewer complications. Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. Daniel closed his eyes and took the kind of deep breath she was learning to recognize as his way of processing overwhelming emotion. When can we see him? Daniel asked. He's in recovery now, probably another hour or two before he's awake enough for visitors. But Mr. Brooks, I want you to know this should solve the problem permanently. With proper follow-up care, Marcus should be able to live a completely normal life. A completely normal life. Eleanor realized she had been holding her breath for weeks waiting to hear those words. Marcus woke up groggy but cheerful, complaining that the hospital food wasn't as good as his father's cooking and asking when he could go home to see the vineyard. His resilience amazed Eleanor, though she was beginning to understand that it shouldn't have surprised her. This boy had been facing uncertainty his entire life with the kind of grace that most adults never achieved. Miss Whitmore, he said sleepily, did you really tell your board that you were converting the vineyard because it was the right thing to do? Eleanor glanced at Daniel, who shrugged as if to say, good luck explaining adult decision-making to someone who still believed the world should make moral sense. Yes, I did. And they were angry. Some of them were. They thought I was making a foolish financial decision. Marcus considered this with the serious expression he brought to important questions. But you did it anyway, even though it cost money and made people angry. Yes. Good, Marcus said firmly. Dad always says that doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would do it all the time. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a settling like soil accepting water after a long drought. This boy who had just undergone major surgery was worried about her moral courage rather than his own recovery. Marcus, she said, I want you to know that you and your father have taught me more about courage than any business school ever could. We have. You've shown me that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible. And your father has shown me that strength isn't about accumulating power. It's about using whatever power you have to protect what matters. Marcus smiled, his eyes already drooping with medication-induced drowsiness. Does that mean you're not just our boss anymore? You're like family. Eleanor looked at Daniel, seeing in his expression the same hope and uncertainty she felt in her own chest. If that's what you'd like, she said carefully. It's what I'd like, Marcus murmured, drifting back towards sleep. Family's supposed to take care of each other, right? And you took care of us when we needed it most. Family. Eleanor had spent 52 years believing that family was something that happened to other people, that her drive and ambition made her unsuitable for the messy compromises that love required. But watching Daniel smooth his son's blanket with infinite tenderness, feeling the warmth that came from knowing she had helped preserve this bond, Eleanor began to understand that family wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about choosing to fight for each other's happiness. It was about measuring success not by what you accumulated, but by what you protected. It was about discovering that love multiplied rather than divided when shared generously. The Vineyard Heritage Foundation officially opened 6 months later on a spring morning when the vines were heavy with new growth and the future felt as bright as California sunshine. Eleanor stood on the main house veranda, watching school buses arrive filled with children who would learn that food didn't magically appear in grocery stores but grew from soil and rain and patient human care. Daniel moved among the tour groups with easy authority, explaining sustainable farming techniques to visitors who hung on his every word. His knowledge was encyclopedic, but he shared it with the gentle humor of someone who understood that learning should be joyful rather than intimidating. Marcus, fully recovered and glowing with health, led a group of teenagers through the wine cellars, explaining how time and patience transform simple grape juice into something complex and memorable. The best wines, Eleanor heard him tell his wide-eyed audience, come from the hardest years. My dad taught me that. Struggle gives depth to sweetness, makes you appreciate what you might otherwise take for granted. Eleanor smiled, recognizing Daniel's wisdom filtered through his son's perspective. Some lessons she was learning were too important to be taught just once. Her phone buzzed with messages from her San Francisco office, quarterly reports, merger opportunities, the endless machinery of empire that still required her attention. But for the first time in her career, business felt like something she did rather than something she was. Her real life was here among people who measured success in relationships rather than revenues and legacy preserved rather than profit maximized. Eleanor. She turned to find Daniel approaching with 2 glasses of wine, the vineyard's own production aged in barrels that remembered decades of harvests. How does it feel? He asked, handing her a glass and settling beside her on the veranda railing. What? Being part of something that builds up instead of breaks down, creating legacy instead of just accumulating wealth. Eleanor tasted the wine, letting its complexity unfold on her tongue. It was extraordinary, layered and patient, rewarding careful attention with subtle revelations. Like coming home, she said finally, like finding out who I was supposed to be all along. They sat in comfortable silence, watching tour groups explore the vineyard and children discover where food actually came from. The scene was peaceful but purposeful, productive but unhurried. Daniel, Eleanor said, do you ever regret it? Staying here instead of taking Marcus to the city where there might have been better opportunities? Daniel's smile was soft with the kind of contentment Eleanor had spent decades seeking in all the wrong places. Eleanor, 3 years ago, I thought opportunities meant money and advancement and moving up in the world. But watching Marcus grow up in this place, seeing him learn that work can be meaningful rather than just profitable, knowing that he understands the difference between success and significance. Daniel paused his gaze following his son as Marcus helped a young visitor identify grape varieties. I think we found the best opportunity of all, which is the chance to build something that matters, the chance to preserve something beautiful, the the chance to raise a child who measures wealth not by what he owns, but by what he gives. Eleanor nodded understanding, flooding through her like recognition of a long-lost truth. And the chance to discover that family isn't just who you're born to, she added softly. It's who you choose to protect and who choose to protect you in return. Daniel raised his glass in a toast. To family, then, however it finds us. To family, Eleanor agreed, clinking her glass against his. And to the courage to choose love over logic, legacy over profit, and preservation over progress. As the sun set over vines that would now grow for generations instead of being destroyed for development, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally learned to measure the right things. Wealth could be accumulated. Legacy could only be preserved. And the difference between the two was everything. Thank you for joining us on Eleanor and Daniel's journey of discovery, healing, and second chances. Their story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the relationships we nurture and the legacy we choose to preserve. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of hope, healing, and the courage to choose love over profit. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that celebrate the human spirit and remind us what truly matters. What did you think of Eleanor's transformation? Have you ever had to choose between what's profitable and what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from our community of dreamers and believers. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from accumulating more, but from preserving what matters most. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.